Right. I'm really excited about doing this introduction because Carrie Howard is going to speak on closing argument. And the first time I heard her name is there's another faculty member here named Richard Luke, who's not here now, but about 10 years ago, I guess something happened. Whoever's from West Palm knows this. There were a bunch of lawyers that were involved in the case, had subpoenas issued against them, and they were all these good guys and good women that were lawyers were being looked at by the government. And Richard Lupin, who always perceives himself as being the greatest lawyer in West Palm, I said, well, who are you going to use if you think you're the greatest lawyer in West Palm Beach? And he said, I'll tell you who I'm going to use, the greatest lawyer in West Palm Beach. And he said, Carrie Howard. I never heard of her at that point, never met her. He said, Drew, this woman is the greatest trial attorney in West Palm Beach. She is phenomenal. I had to be the first one to get her on the phone, claim her as my own. And I've never tried a case with Carrie. But Denise Delaware, who unfortunately works she is the trial consultant / jury consultant, who works the first week of the second session, is one of my best friends in the world, someone who I've tried cases with literally all over the country. And every time we're together, I hear, well, this is how Carrie would do it. Everybody that's tried a case with her will tell you she is the type of lawyer who wins the unwinnable case. There you go. Okay. But that is her reputation, is the type of person that can win the unwinnable case, the type of lawyer that does not walk into a case thinking, well, the facts are really tough, I don't have a shot. Rather, she's the type of lawyer that walks in thinking, I don't care how many evidences there are, I'm going to get it not guilty when all's said and done. And most of all, she's just the greatest person on the earth. She was so nice. She's unbelievable. She is so nice. It's unbelievable. She is angelic. I just told her, I said, I know that I'm as close to Satan as you can get. And I know that I'm a big promoter of going to hell. All right? But I tell you what, man, you feel like you're in heaven when you're around. So anyway, that being said, the other night we shared information on sleazy hired guns that we both hire when we know they're full of crap, but we use them anyway. So anyway, go ahead, good luck. Mazel tov.
Oh my God, is this going to be a letdown for you? This is the first time I have lectured on closing arguments, so we'll see how this goes. But it is something I have researched for years. And in the last couple of days, knowing I was going to be doing this lecture, I have undertaken some very intensive research. I have spent lots of time and energy and alcohol researching this very interesting topic. And the way I research it is the way I do closing arguments. And that's talking to the best lawyers I know about their ideas and their thoughts and their insights into what makes closing arguments work. And I will have to credit Drew with one of, I think, the most perceptive descriptions of closing arguments when we were talking about it last night. He said, you know, a closing argument is like an emotional one-night stand. And we started talking about it, and you know, that's right. It's like you think you're really great. You give it all you got. And the next morning you still have regrets, right? Well, that's the way your closing arguments are always going to be. Mine have always been. When you sit down and you think you've done great, you still know there's something more you wish you had said. That's life, and that's a closing argument. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some thoughts and ideas that really as a group I think are very helpful in talking about closing arguments. As I say, if this goes good, you know, applaud me for being a good researcher. If it goes bad, blame my friends, and we'll just see at the end. When I was thinking about closing arguments, I thought really there's sort of three things to talk about. I think about the wisdoms, the rules, and the techniques. So let's talk first about really common wisdoms about closing arguments. The purpose of closing arguments is not to change anybody's mind. Because when you're there, at that point, you better have them with you. Or you better have some strong folks with you. I really think the purpose of closing arguments is to arm the jurors who are on your side with the arguments that they will take into the jury room to their fellow jurors, with the rebuttals to the fellow jurors' arguments about the state's case, to the explanation for the questions about the evidence. You give them the arguments to make, and you arm them with the arguments and the passion to make those. You also arm them with the strength, because I tell you, my philosophy is the guilty juries are the mean jurors. And we need our jurors to be strong and courageous and believe in what they're doing. And I think that's what closing arguments should do. It should make them strong and make them courageous and make them feel good about what they want to do for your client. I think another sort of wisdom about closing arguments is jurors, in my 21 years experience, have gotten progressively smarter. They're pretty well educated about the system, they're pretty well educated about trials, and I have seen them getting far more active in trials than I saw even 10 years ago. We have jurors asking questions, we have jurors trying to kick other jurors off the jury because they don't like them. We have them being very active, very assertive in the courtroom. And I think you insult them in closing argument by spoon-feeding them basic information, by spoon-feeding them the obvious facts. Closing argument is the opportunity to talk about the inferences from the evidence, to talk about the things that maybe aren't so obvious or aren't so clear. But it is not the time to go through in detail all the minutiae, every little tiny thing or every really big obvious thing that helps your case. Because if they haven't gotten that by then, they're not getting it from you in closing arguments. The other thing I think is important about closing arguments is being entertaining. Jurors want entertainment. They want it to be interesting. And you know, my feelings are they have a right to be entertained. We have asked of them time, we've asked of them their attention, we've asked of them a great commitment, and we're asking them to do something very important for our client. The least we can do is entertain them for a little bit. And that's what I think closing argument also should do. It should be interesting. It should entertain them. It should keep their attention. I'm a believer in not terribly long closing arguments. I think that it is unfair to take advantage of the captive audience. I don't think that it is a time to go on and on and on and lose what is most important about closing argument, and that is bringing them back to the emotional climate of the case. And you lose that with time, and you lose that with words if it goes too long. So I'm a believer in short is better in closing arguments if you're making your points properly. The other wisdom about closing arguments for all of you tomorrow, and when we go back and talk this afternoon again about sort of brainstorming closing arguments, do what I've done today and what I do with all my cases. Steal from others. Steal with reckless abandon people's ideas, their terms, their phrases, their visions, if it works for you. But this isn't a time where you have to feel like I've got to have my sort of unique thumbprint. This is a time to do whatever it takes for your client. And often our relatives, our friends have great ideas about how things can be portrayed that will be far more persuasive than what we might really think about it. So talk to folks, steal from folks and use it, but be sure it works for you. I've seen lawyers do these like fabulous closing arguments with quotes. You know, they quote from the Bible or they quote from historical documents or famous people. I am like horrible with quotes. I screw up quotes all the time. I never can get it right. And I remember early on trying that because I was so impressed watching these lawyers do, you know, some closing arguments with great quotes and quickly realized it ain't for me. So also know what works for you. Don't try to imitate somebody's style that is not yours, that you don't feel in your stomach and in your heart is really you. So steal ideas, but use your own ways, use your own approach, because that's the only way jurors are going to know it's real. Let's talk about what I think are some real basic rules. The things that I think are just kind of absolute, this you don't do, this you do. Like I said, I think closing arguments are the opportunity to return to the emotional climate of the case, to connect what should be in their hearts with the evidence they've heard, and take it back to that place that is the most, it has the strongest persuasion, and that is their hearts. Don't start with a thank you very much, appreciate your attention, we like you, we thank you. There's nothing to thank them about until you find out what they got to say, you know? And it immediately detracts from you being able to get started and get them back to where you want them to be. Remember, it's generally right after the prosecutor has made their spiel. You need to quickly establish where you want them to be. And taking the time to do the thank yous or do the kind of bullshit preliminaries is what I say, detracts from that. So there's no reason for it. There's no reason for what the prosecutor, you know, ever to be talking about it as an evidence, or you've seen the pieces of the puzzle, or whatever the little lines are. No reason. Go to your theory, your story, your purpose immediately. Do not, you know, when you think about your closing argument, and then you sit and you listen to the prosecutor, don't change what you've got to say and become simply responsive to them. If you've done the kind of preparation that I'm sure you can for your closing argument, you've already anticipated their arguments. You know what they're going to say. Don't become just responsive and reactive to them. Go back to you control what's going on. You establish what's important. I've seen lawyers, of course, that have, you know, nice closings all ready to go, and then they get mad at what the prosecutor had to say, and they jump up and they immediately start with, well, he says this or she says this, and that's not true because blah, 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 losing completely the focus on their theory and their theme. Don't be reactive. You know, the thing about closing is, frankly, if you haven't picked the right jury and you haven't captured their hearts in your opening and you haven't dictated their vision through your theory and you haven't told them your themes through your cross and your direct, your closing can be pretty darn short because it's not going to make any difference. Don't ever think closing argument is the most important part of the case. It feels good, but it is not ever going to be the most important part of the case. Never, ever forego evidence for your argument. I don't know how many jurisdictions have what we have in Florida, but that is if you don't put on any evidence other than your client, you get first and last. If you put on evidence, you're in the middle. I just believe across the board, if you have evidence, you better put it on. Because what you have to say in closing is never going to measure up to the benefit of having some evidence. And really what you say in closing shouldn't matter whether it's first, last, or in the middle. It's your story. It's what you have to say. And it doesn't matter whether it's in the middle, if it's at the beginning, or where it is. Don't give up something that can help your client because you think you can do something magical at the end of the case. Use the law. We talk a lot about feelings and emotions and being in touch and doing it from your heart and all of that, and that is really important. But it's also important to have the law. I don't care if it's one word out of the jury instruction, what it is, but find something to hang your story on. You have to let the jury know that what they feel in their heart is right, and the law says it's right. You have to be able to be on guard for the prosecutor who actually does a good job and can stand up and say, you know, this is a tragedy. This 18-year-old boy going to prison for the rest of his life is a darn shame. Nobody's going to be happy about it. Nobody's going to celebrate it. But the law requires it. Don't let yourself fall into that trap. I always find some hook, even if it's like, I don't care what it is. I find something that the judge is going to tell the jury that I can weave into my closing argument. So it's clear I'm not just trying to persuade them with fancy talk or make them feel sorry for my client, that there's a reason the law recognizes what they know in their heart is the right thing. Objections, make them. I don't believe in let's be polite and not interrupt each other. Make your objections, be on guard for them, and be prepared to receive them. Because if you're doing your job, you are pushing the envelope. And you're going to get objections. Don't ever think, I don't know if I should say this because they might object. You say what you think you ought to say and be prepared, if they object, how to respond. And be prepared to go right back to where you are. Don't let it throw you off your game. Deal with it and move on. But don't avoid saying things because you think it might be objected to. Prepare for it ahead of time. Be prepared for it. Move on after it's dealt with. Don't let it throw you off. Notes. I use notes. Cheater. I can't do it without notes. Now, I don't write out, what I'm going to say, but just to know that you have something in the event you sort of lose where you're going. But by closing, if you don't know your case, notes ain't going to help you. You're going to know your case and have confidence you're going to know your case. And like I say, know you're going to forget some things. Know there's going to be some things that you're going to miss. And that's what happens in closing arguments. But the more detailed you make your notes, the more you get tied to them. And so, I just do like we've talked about for everything else. Topics, chapters, however you want to do it, but something really just to jog your memory. Because if the picture is in your mind, you can talk about it. You don't need to read it. You might need to have something that just kind of keeps you focused on it. A reminder, a word, a phrase. But when you start doing your detailed notes, you're going to get tied to it and it's going to mess you up. Now, sometimes I'll tell you this, what I do is when I really think I'm being brilliant, at 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm thinking of all the great ways to say what I think I need to say. sometimes I'll just write it out, but then throw it away. Because sometimes the writing helps me rather than it just kind of churning around in my head if I write it out. But I don't ever use those notes when I'm actually giving the closing argument. Because I'm not going to say it the same way as I said it at 2 o'clock in the morning, hopefully. Because I've seen some of the stuff I've written at 2 o'clock in the morning. But nor do I want to. Because that's when it's no longer spontaneous and it's no longer from my heart, but instead it's from my papers. Use your voice. Use your tempo. Use your words to tell the story again, to bring the story back that you've been talking about for whether it's a half a day or 3 weeks. But use all of those things to talk and convey in your closing arguments. And finally, as Denise Delarue was so helpful to me in doing a closing argument in a death penalty case where my client was videotaped shooting a man who was tied to a tree, right before I got up to make what I thought was probably one of the most important closing arguments I was going to make in my life, she very kindly handed me a note. DFU. Don't fuck up. So, that's the other rule. All right, let's talk about techniques. There are a variety of techniques to use in closing arguments. There's a variety of ways to convey what you have to say, just as there are with openings and your cross and your direct. So what I thought I would kind of do, rather than tell you there's like one technique that's better than any other technique in the world, I just thought I'd share with you some of the techniques that I have used and that I have seen other people use and that I think are effective. But once again, it really kind of depends on your case and your own sense of comfort with the technique. And I also, in doing this, we were talking last night, and I think it was Gary Christie said that, you know, some of the participants talk about they don't like it when we just sort of talk esoterically about what to do and then make you go do it yourself and then stand up and do a demo to show you all the ways that it should have been done. So to be fair, I thought we ought to talk about some techniques and do a little sort of illustrating of those techniques. So one of the techniques that I have used and that I think can be very effective, I have seen other people use, is telling your story through the eyes and the voice of somebody else in a first-person sense. And the reason this can be very effective is it really allows you to get into the story and convey it. And I was thinking about as, you know, a little sort of example of what I'm talking about would be in Mario Dodd's case, for example. That if you picture Mario's stepdaughter talking to the jury, the daughter of Judy Dodd, what would she tell them? You know, I love my mother, but I sure wish she could get it right. I sure wish she could treat Mario a little better. He's so nice to us. He takes such good care of us. He feeds us. He clothes us. He plays with us. And she treats him so badly. She's so rude to him. She doesn't come home when she says she will. She doesn't act lovingly towards him. And he's always there, and he's always wanting her, and she's just not very nice to Mario. I wish my mother knew how to tell the truth. You know, she lies to us all the time. She says she'll be home for dinner. She doesn't come home But she'll say, gee, I'm so sorry. She's so convincing. She's so convincing with her lies. But we know it's a lie. I wish my mother would think of somebody other than herself. Just once. I wish she'd think of somebody else. But she doesn't. I don't think she can. Because for my mom, Judy Dodd is all that's important. I wish she didn't value money so much. Yeah, we're poor. Yeah, we don't have that much. But we could have each other. But for her, all that seems to matter is money. It's all she talks about. It's all she works for. It's all we ever hear about around the house is money. I wish something more important, there was something more important to her, like love or loyalty. But that's my mom. So that's an example of that technique. No, you don't have to do that. But thank you. Another technique is to visualize in your mind a scene that to you really portrays an important issue in the case. And I do this in a lot of ways. I don't always use it as an argument. I often use it to sort of center myself emotionally in a case. And that is to find, and actually some of this for me, and I've heard other people talk about it, and they talk about it much better and more eloquently and intelligently. But for me, it kind of started with doing death penalty work. And I've represented some people who a lot of other people don't like. And when I get them, they're pretty unlikable. And it takes a while to find that time in their life when they were likable. And so it often, for me, is like just a technique to help me really connect with my client, is to find that time in their life before they started killing and robbing and beating and raping, when they were lovable, and connect to that. And sometimes it's through looking at their pictures as kids. Sometimes it's from seeing their transformation over time. Sometimes it's from talking to a neighbor or a family member about a special event in their lives, and I see them totally differently based on that. So in closing argument, though, you can also do this by using a scene that in your mind really portrays an important issue in the case. And when I was thinking about this for today, I thought about Bonnie Kitchen's, easy one. And you know, there's lots of scenes in Bonnie's case. But one that for me is pretty compelling is when she was 9. And she was probably a normal child. She, during the day, had a normal life. She'd go to school with the other kids, she'd play games, she'd come home, she'd do her work, her little homework, she probably had some chores she did, talk on the phone to her friends. She had a normal life during the day. It was at night that her life changed. When her little body was in her bed, and she would lay there, and she would listen for the footsteps of her uncle. And she'd listen for him walking down the hall and coming into her room. She'd know what was coming. She'd know it's going to be the hot beer breath on her face and the rough, calloused hands on her breasts and the tearing and the ripping when he entered her. She'd know it was coming. And there wasn't a thing she could do about it. She couldn't run. Where would she run? She couldn't fight. He was big. He was powerful. She couldn't tell anybody who would believe her. She knew she couldn't do anything. the one thing she could take comfort in was he was coming to her and not her little sister. So that's a scene out of Bonnie Kitchens that might help you see a little bit about what could work in portraying scenes. And you can really do your closing through a series, almost like vignettes, and go from one scene to another without necessarily, connecting it all. But, it gives such a visual image. And it's not something you ever have to write out. If you can see it in your mind, if you see it, you can talk about it. You can describe it, and you can make it real to those jurors. Another technique that I really like, I've never been a prosecutor. I don't know how many of you have been prosecutors. I've never been a prosecutor, and I've never really wanted to be a prosecutor, except, occasionally, I think, it would be really fun. Just because they got all the games, right? They got all the help, all the money, all the investigators, all the evidence usually, lots of witnesses. Wouldn't that be fun to have that easy road to hoe? Well, there are certainly cases where you can be the prosecutor, and it is fun. I've done it, and man, you can kind of get a kick out of it. And the Baker case is kind of a good case for that, where you prosecute the three men in the park, where you put them in the chairs at the defense table, and you prosecute them. Now, how easy would that be? Think about it. Those three guys in the park, sitting at the table as the prosecutor, Mr. Husser's last words, very last words. Three men. He's dying. His last breath is three men. And they come in here and tell you, oh no, don't believe that. Believe Larry Baker. Believe the, two-time convicted felon who's so pathetic, doesn't have any friends except this Roger Moss and this Jesus Otero in the whole world. That's the best he can do. They come to you and they say, oh no, believe him over Mr. Husser's. Believe what he says about it. How absurd, how ridiculous to think that Mr. Husser's is wrong. You've heard about Mr. Husser's, you've heard about his character, you've heard from his family, from his friends, from his employer. This man was an upstanding member of our community. He was trustworthy, he was honest. And they want you to believe Larry Baker over Mr. Husser's. How absurd. So that's sort of a little thing on that technique. And that can be really fun just because it really gets you out of, it enables you to take so much from what they do. And you organize it from the beginning to the end the same way you would if you were prosecuting them. Make sure you've gotten the elements of the offense out, all the details, all the things you would need for your closing argument to prosecute those three men who so brutally murdered Mr. Husser's in the park that night. Another sort of technique, and this was something we were talking about last night, is kind of the political or global themes that we see in our cases. And James Brown is a good example of that. James Brown is really about how we treat the mentally retarded, how we are going to treat them. Are we going to hold them? Is it fair to hold them to a standard they can't possibly fulfill? A standard of communication, a standard of knowledge, a standard of understanding that that they cannot achieve. They can't achieve it not because of any fault of their own, but just because of the sheer randomness of being born mentally retarded. So that's kind of the political global theme if you want to talk about those kinds of issues in a particular case. Another technique that I kind of have heard people talk about and have used myself is the what if. It's kind of what if. Let's talk about what if. You know, with Bonnie, let's picture what if she had not stopped the blow to her belly? What if she had not prevented Albie from beating her child inside her? We talked a lot about her fear that that child would die. But what if that blow, just made him brain damaged? What if that blow just made it so that child would live in diapers for the rest of his life? What if that blow would make it so that child could never read a book, never hold a job, never find love or enlightenment? Did she have the right to protect him from that? Did she have that right that day? Yeah! Yeah! A final little technique I want to share with you is, I'm not a big one myself on sort of the presumption of innocence, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think we get a lot of those terms. You really have to artfully figure out how to use that language, because it comes off sounding nah. They've heard it from the beginning in the jury instructions and, some voir dire. They've heard it. It's like those commercials where you just start hearing blah, 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 blah. You have to make it really mean something. Make it mean something to what they're doing and what their obligation is. And sometimes what I think of it as, and talk to jurors about, is their right to demand that the government present evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Their right not to wake up tomorrow, or a week from tomorrow, or a month or a year from tomorrow with a doubt. And that it's not fair to them for the government to come in with the kind of evidence that they presented in this case and ask them to shoulder the blame for making a mistake. And that's what proof beyond a reasonable doubt is all about. And that's the juror's right to demand it. And I think that's kind of a nice way to embolden them to say, if we have to say not guilty, it isn't our fault, it's their fault. And I think that kind of empowering is a healthy thing for jurors. I am, not even close to sort of exhausting the list of techniques. I kind of just wanted to give you some thoughts and some examples and some things to think about as you creatively go to work on your things for tomorrow. There's any number of ways to approach closing. But the most important thing is you don't forget what you're doing, that you're bringing them back. You're bringing them back to the story. You're bringing them back to what matters. You're bringing them back to feeling it in their gut and in their heart, and knowing what the right thing to do is. So I hope I've added a little to your arsenals. Arsenals we use for fighting that good fight, for advocating for our clients. the cause of liberty. Good luck.